morning. I'm delighted to be here with you all, Tulane, and all of the members who aren't a part of the university but are here in this group. So far, there's about 120 of us, and I'm hyped that on this afternoon, this evening, we can be sharing this space together. This is for us writers, us readers, us girls who never saw ourselves on bookshelves, but we're still writing poems when we talked. And we've been called teeth sucking of snapping eyes, born bitter, brittle of tangled tongues, sandpaper that's been origamied into girl, not worthy of being the hero, nor the author, but we were always Medusa's favorite daughters of serpent curls, of hard-eyed looks, dreaming in the foreshadow. We composed ourselves since childhood, taking pens to our palms as if we could rewrite the stanzas of lifelines that try to tell us we would never amount to much. And when we were relegated to the margins, we still danced bachata in the footnotes. We still clawed ourselves to the page, our every color palette and bouquet of pansies, of big gold hoops, of these here hips and smart ass quips and popping bubble gum kisses, us girls who never saw ourselves on bookshelves, but were still writing stories in the dark, us Black and brown girls, brick built, masters of every metaphor and every metamorphosis, catch us with fresh manicures, nail filing down obsidian stone and painstakingly crafting our own mirrors and stories into existence. Thank you. I wanted to open up with a poem and a reading from my most recent novel, Clap When You Land. I always think it helps root us if we're in the actual literature. I find I'm more articulate in things I've revised. And so hopefully you'll hold this as the impression in your brain when I'm speaking later. The story Clap When You Land is based on true events. In 2001, 2 months and 1 day after the attacks on the World Trade Center, there was a plane on its way from New York City to the Dominican Republic that crashed a few minutes after takeoff. And it was a flight that was 95% full of Dominican nationals. And I viscerally remember what it felt like to watch such a tragedy that struck so close to my community that was, it felt like largely absent from the national conversation. And so I've been turning that kind of story, all those folks who were lost, neighbors that we knew, people from the church, and what would it mean to write something inspired from that loss and looking at that kind of tragedy. And what I ended up writing, which is one of the things I love about literature, is you set out with one idea and you discover so many other things you're trying to say. The story became about two sisters who don't know about each other. One lives in the Dominican Republic, one lives in New York City. Their father had two families and they don't learn about each other until one of them inherits money because he died in a plane crash. And it is in this one wanting to go to DR, one wanting to come to the States, and this dual narrative that I was really able to discover this story of grief and loss. And I want to read briefly from Camino's section. Camino is a sister who lives in the Dominican Republic. You learn very early on that her father wasn't just a protective force in terms of physically, but his money was also a kind of protection, and he would pay off basically pimps in the area who otherwise would have targeted his daughter for sex work. And now that he is gone, there is this guy that is trying to coerce Camino into sex work. And so this section is from Camino's point of view. Dia tells me she has heard rumors. She is speaking to me the next morning as we wait news about Papi's body. Her hands pluck the feathers off a chicken. She is methodical, her fingers fast along the fluff that she drops into a plastic bag in the kitchen sink. The big machete that never far from her side catches the light through the window. It glints at me. and I wish I could carry it always. Tia tells me both Don Mateo and the woman who sells fruit have mentioned seeing El Cero waiting for me after school or walking from the beach soon after I've left it. She says the saints have whispered caution in her ear. I take a deep breath. I want to tell Tia it's all true, that I'm afraid of the thing El Cero wants to ask of me. Her voice is stripped of any emotions, but if fingers can be angry, hers must be wrathful. She plucks in hard snatches. I raised you smart, right, girl? This is not a question she actually wants answered. I can tell by how fast she speaks. Tia's anger now sounds like it could be directed at me. That thought puts a staying hand on the words that were going to leap from my lips. I raised you clean and fed even when my feet were soiled, when my own stomach rumbled, right, girl? I grew you up for a future different than the one most girls around here are allowed. Choices. Did I not do everything to provide you choices? The feathers bulge in the bag, and I wish I was just as light. I feel weighed down. Her words turned me stone. Tia thinks I have been inviting El Cero's attention. Somehow his stalking has turned into something I must have done. The chicken is nearly naked, raw and puckered, dressed in saggy skin, a feast for our hunger, a place to gnash our teeth, since neither one of us can bite at the world. I am from a playground place. Our oceans that we need for fish are cleared so extranjeros can kite surf. Our land, lush and green, is bought and sold to foreign powers so they can build luxury hotels for others to rest their heads. The bananas and juca and sugarcane farmed and harvested, exported, while kids thank God for every little scrap. The developed world wastes gas, raises carbon emissions and water levels that threaten to disappear us in a single gulp. Even the women, girls like me, our mothers and tias, our bodies are branded jungle gyms. Men with accents pick us as if from a brochure to climb and slide and swing. And him, El Cero, he has his hand in every pocket. If you are not from an island, you cannot understand what it is to be of water, to learn to curve around the bend, to learn to rise with rain, to learn to quench an outside thirst while all the while you grow shallow until there is not one drop left for you. I know that this is what Tia does not say. Sand and soil and sinew and smiles, all bartered. And who reaps? Who eats? Not us, not me. Thank you. I'm so excited to speak with Professor Caballero and Sophie.
Yeah, we are thrilled to have you. And we thought there was no better way to begin this event, Elizabeth, than have you read. And thank you very much, especially that first poem you read. I have it quoted in my notes tonight because there's some really amazing, it's absolutely amazing. So welcome everybody to our conversation this evening with Elizabeth Acevedo. Buenas tardes y casi buenas noches from a rainy New Orleans. My name is Carolina Caballero and I am the Zamuri Stone Senior Professor of the Practice and Associate Director for the Institute of Cuban and Caribbean Studies here at Tulane University. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the event this evening with poet, performer, novelist, and storyteller, Elizabeth Acevedo. So before we get started, even though we already kind of have, I would like to thank our sponsors. First, the Stone Center for Latin American Studies and the Newcomb Institute. A particular gracias to Denise Waltering Vargas, Senior Program Manager and Director of the Latin American Resource Center. Also, a thank you to Valerie McGinley and Hannah Palmer for all their hard work on this. We'd also like to thank Laura Walford, the Associate Director of the Newcomb Institute. I also like to acknowledge our partners for this event, the New Orleans Center for the Gulf South and the Office of Multicultural Affairs, who both organized events in support of this evening's conversation with Elizabeth. Last Tuesday, Professor Denise Frazier, Assistant Director for the Center of the Gulf South, hosted a lovely encounter between two local poets, Jose Fermin and Wood de la, I'm gonna say his last name wrong, de la Jose, which was absolutely delightful. And this Thursday, everybody mark your calendars, Thursday, starting at 5 o'clock, March 25th, there will be an open mic in celebration of Elizabeth Acevedo's work, hosted by the Tulane Black Student Union and the Office of Multicultural Affairs. So thank you so much to Sienna Abdullahad, Director of Multicultural Affairs, Kamaya Stewart, Raven Ankar, Alexa Thorley, and Jasmine Washington for making that happen. While tonight's event with Elizabeth is a celebration of Afro-Latinx identity, culture, and voices, we'd like to officially recognize that we are not the first peoples on this space now called New Orleans. The indigenous nations of the Chitimacha, Choctaw, Ishak, Tunica, Homa, and Natchez, to name a few, called this area Bulbancha, which means river of many tongues. While only the Chitimacha, the Coushatta, the Jena Choctaw, and the Tunica Biloxi tribes are federally recognized, we here today pay homage to the continuing contributions of all Louisiana indigenous peoples to the culture and eminent lifeways of the city, the state, and the Gulf South. Let us remember that we share this sacred land with the generations of people who came before us and acknowledge their legacy and continuing struggle. Just to let you guys know a little bit of the structure for tonight's talk, we started off with Elizabeth, and we are going to do a little bit of question and answer conversation between Sophie and I, who I'm about to introduce, and Elizabeth. And then Elizabeth will do, I think, another reading, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A. I have the distinct honor of moderating this evening, but I won't be alone. I'm sharing these honors with Sophie Sanchez, who is a second-year undergraduate from Chicago. She's double majoring in public health and gender and sexuality studies. Sophie is a Newcomb Scholar, a member of SAFE, the Sexual Aggression Peer Hotline and Education, and a public affairs intern at Planned Parenthood of the Gulf South. And so I'm gonna turn the mic or the video or the word, dale la palabra, a Sophie, so she can introduce our guests.
Thank you. And I'm thrilled to formally introduce our guest for tonight, Elizabeth Acevedo. Elizabeth Acevedo is a Dominican-American award-winning poet, novelist, and performer. She is a National Poetry Slam champion and winner of the National Book Award and the Carnegie Medal for her New York Times bestselling novel, The Poet X, among many other distinctions. Her latest book, Clap When You Land, is a Boston Globe Horn Book Award honor book and a Kirkus finalist. So without further ado, thank you and welcome, Elizabeth Acevedo.
Thank you. Such a pleasure to be here with you both and with all the folks, joining us, although I cannot see them.
Right. And there's a lot of them, which is very exciting. Okay, so Elizabeth, I'm going to start a little bit. I'd like to start with kind of your origin story, perhaps. And a little bit, one of the topics for tonight is Afro-Latinx identity, which is not a new identity by any stretch of the imagination, but it's been relatively invisible in terms of representation, right? So I want you to talk a little bit about you coming into that identity, the process, the challenges, the negotiations that you took to embrace that identity, to live it plenamente, to live it completely. And I ask you that question because of those of us that grew up in kind of two different worlds, at one point we all side with one of the worlds or the other, like kind of excise part of our identity. And sometimes it's a journey to bring them both together. And I'd like you to talk to us a little bit about your journey of bringing that identity together.
Yeah. I want to start off by saying that I don't consider my journey fully complete, right? I think that part of the reason I write is to attempt to find precise language for the things I feel and I'm trying to say about myself in the world. And while I've arrived at Afro-Latinx, I think there is still a journey towards even more precision, right? And I really go by Afro-Dominican because I think it is a distinct identity from someone who may be Garifuna or who may be Afro-Boricua or who may be Afro-Mexican, that Afro-Latinidad. Sometimes when the words get too big, they're trying to hold too much in too many different people. in a way that does us disservice, right? Because it doesn't allow the specific stories or arrivals of folks to be clear. But my story is one, my parents immigrated to the United States, to New York City from the Dominican Republic in 1979. My mother is fairer than my father, but they both have Black mothers, right? So it's like a mixed people, children of mixed people, children of, or a variety of folks. So I have a lot of shades in my family. But growing up in the US, the conversation of race was one that felt really confusing when I was a child, right? And I would ask my parents, like, you know, kids at school want to know what I am. And their answer is like, oh, you're brown. And I'm like, that's a Crayola color, but that's not, that's not gonna fit with the conversation we're having, right? And so even as a child, there was kind of a journey for naming. And at home, that naming didn't feel accurate or clear. And there were distinctions I could tell that made me feel like a name was important. That there were white Dominicans in the building, or there were indigenous Mexican folks in the area, or, you know, that when I tried to understand some of the hierarchies I would see and how people were treated, to say, well, we're all Latino didn't make sense, right? Because there was this clear thing I felt in me that was like, no, but the blue-eyed blonde girl who is also, you know, Latina is receives preferences that as a child I couldn't make sense of, right? Or when we watched Miss Universo, which for some reason my family loved, or even Sábado Gigante, right? Like the figures you saw of quote unquote
Absolutely.
God were highly specific kinds of folks. And so the understanding of Latinidad that I had as a child was one where I was non-existent, where I was not in it, even though my entire community looked like me, or majority of my community looked like me. And when I went to the Dominican Republic, I could tell, you know, I'm of here, but it's this, it just didn't feel like on a larger scope, there was a place for me, right? And as someone who, you know, I always say I belonging to belong. Like my whole life has been searching, like, who are my people? Where is my community? What does it mean to build this this identity, right? Because it's not one that has been handed down from my parents. There's not an inheritance of like, here's who you are. There is a daily practice of what I am choosing to find and learn. I mean, y'all see all my books, if you could see the titles, it's all just what are the racial migrations of Caribbean and Dominican folks here, and what are the different understandings of ourselves, right? So it's really been a building. But when I was in high school, I started learning more about Pan-Africanism. I started really doing research on who are the folks that have been left out of the story globally. And I think that I realized that time and time again, right? It was the somos todo negro atrás de las orejas. It was always this like, we're Black, we're Afro, and that's like a part of it. Comemos sancocho y mondongo and all these things that are from West Africa, but we hide it. And so Afro-Latinidad felt like a way to say, I'm not going to hide it, right? The Latinidad is often stamped on me depending the space that I'm in. And I think that's the thing, right? With any racial identity, it's so, it has a lot to do with the spaces that you're in and how people read you. And for me, when I came to DC, there weren't Dominicans here. And so I was read very differently. When I go to South Africa or when I go to Spain, my body is read in very particular ways. And so I just had to kind of grapple with, I don't want to erase further. And even though I know that Afro-Latinidad opens up other questions and other things that I then need to find the texture for, it felt the most accurate towards wanting to do right by the ancestors I have and the stories I have to tell that felt like they were always marginalized.
Right. Thank you very much. I think it's yeah, and I didn't mean to, when I was reading the question, I didn't mean to, I absolutely think it's a process. It's a continuous process, right? Because in each space, it's different. You have to negotiate it. It's a constant negotiation, right?
And language doesn't work, right? Like, not that it doesn't work, the language is slow. And so even with Latinx, what we're seeing is that the X is something that is difficult. And I remember when the word first came out and I thought, I love being more inclusive and I don't think this is going to be the end of this word either. right? But is it Latin, or is it, how are they using it in Latin America? How is the Caribbean? But that I think folks don't realize Latino is of the last however many years that it's been,
Right.
maybe last 40 years, that Hispanic, like that their words evolve. And so
Mhm.
I am open to the process of, this is the most precise language I have right now, as I'm still trying to find more. And I think as a collective, we're trying to find, accurate ways to name ourselves.
Right, right. Great. And so my next question is about your role, this idea of, and I introduced you as a performer, a poet, a teacher, a novelist, and as a storyteller. I want to talk a little bit about that role as storyteller. I want to, I don't know, was your family a family of stories, right? Did you have storytellers growing up, and where did that come from? And I feel like storytelling it's an empowering practice. So I want to know a little bit about how you came upon that.
Yeah, I definitely come from storytellers. I would say, yeah, all of the elders that I had are very much my grandfather, who moved to the US when I was 5 and was the person who took me to and from school in those very early years. And he loved riddles. My grandfather had a 3rd grade education. He came from herding oxen. He was pretty much a sharecropper in the Dominican Republic. And he would memorize these long riddles, probably 15, 20 minutes long, right? And he would love reciting them, or these songs or these poems, or, I mean, my family, heavily Catholic, so prayers, but this idea of an unlettered person who loved to pass down stories was very clear for me from the beginning. My father loves telling barbershop jokes. They're always inappropriate, but I think there was a ear for me on timing. There was this idea of, my father went out and heard someone tell something and learned how to tell it, and then he came home and he told it here. Now we've all learned how to tell, right? That this a transfer of information or of entertainment, right? That I think that came through. But honestly, I'll say my mother and my brothers probably have some of the strongest influence on my wanting to tell stories. That my mother would tell me about the Dominican Republic. My father's not a very talkative man when it comes about to himself. And so I didn't know a lot about my past or my history or my grandparents. My mother would tell me stories about his family and also her own, right? And she's almost a fantastical storyteller. And as a child growing up in New York with fire escapes and big buildings and, millions of people, to hear about my mother, the campesina, who stole her father's Jaguar and rode it into town and then fell off of it and had to go home and get in trouble. And, her brother who fell trying to cut a mango and cut his thumb off. Like, all of this felt like even more than Harry Potter fantastical. Just like, wait, and this was real? Like, all of this happened. La tia que se montó with a saint. And so for me, the access to, there is adventure, there is texture, there is nuance, there is language, here's the description. Like, my mother made me want to go to her home, and my mother made me feel closer to being able to say I was Dominican, even though I hadn't spent a lot of time there, because of what her stories allowed me to understand about her, and thusly about me. And my brothers, when my parents went to bed, played a lot of hip hop. And so my earliest journey into storytelling was wanting to write rap songs, because it felt like Nas and, Remy and Tupac were folks who figured out how to carry language. Here's a thing: if you write it and it rhymes and you memorize it, it is in your body and you can take it anywhere. And I think hip hop, offered that gift that I really needed. So it's a
Great.
hodgepodge, but certainly the oral storytelling is huge. And I was a voracious reader, but before I thought of myself as a writer, all of those other influences, I think, made me think of myself as someone who was dealing in orality.
Mm-hmm. And it kind of connected with orality, and we discussed this before this started. I discovered you through Beast Girl and other origin myths, and I am fascinated by this book and your this idea of a beast girl, your use of Dominican cultural figures, some of them historical, all mythological, right? And Medusa in the poem that you read at the beginning, right? The quote that I have here is, "We were not worthy of being the hero, not the author, but we were always Medusa's favorite daughters of serpent curls and hard-eyed looks." So, and then you create your own myth, right, in this book, and La Negra, right? So I wanted to ask you, so this is kind of a twofold question, right? Because in that book, I see these poems as a celebration of Dominican American culture, custom stories, even superstitions, right? But also these are stories or poems about shame, violence, sexism, machismo, silencing, and resentment. So my questions is, first is this, how do you, number one, what is a beast girl? When I first read about the Beast Girls, I thought of that as something negative, but now I'm seeing it as something positive, right? Or it can be empowering if read in a certain way. And how do you feel about these myths and these legends and these superstitions that you write about here? And the second one, my second question about this is, are the protagonists in your novels, Xiomara, Yahaira, Camino, and Moni, are they a response to these myths and these legends and these female figures, these monstrous female figures, in a way, like resisting? Do they resist them?
Yeah, this is these are good questions. Okay, Carolina, I see you, Professor Caballero. This is why you get the big bucks. This is why you lead courses, right? No, but that's real. You know, I think Beast Girl comes out of some of the questions I've been trying to answer. When there is no easy place to fit, there is a way in which one feels monstrous. That yeah, maybe you know, the Beast Girl poems for me don't really aren't easy to remove from what my project is with Medusa, right? That this idea of who are the figures you turn to in mythology. And I don't know, Dominican Republic has this fascination with Greek mythology, and you know, you'll meet people who are named Adonis and like, you know, Socrates, like
Right.
Jocasta. I had a friend named Jocasta. Like it's these naming. And so I thought, I'm so tired of the classics. And even in grad school, it felt like the classics, you know, always took precedent. It was always the anecdotes. It was always the way that people started poems, as if it would offer all this credence. And yet when I tried to proffer my own myths or my own philosophers or folks from the Caribbean, there was oh, but this isn't, you know, this isn't Plato. And it's like, but you know, what is offered to us and what we receive and how we use that is all that truly matters when it comes to the language we choose to use and move forward with. And so then I wanted to play with it. Well, okay, if they tell me that Greek mythology is the classics, then you know what? I'm gonna take the biggest monster that I think would get it. And the story of Medusa was one that's always fascinated me. And like you said, you know, it is one full of violence. It is one full of fear. It is one full of some of the things we see in the story of Beast Girl or of La Negra. This idea of here's this woman who is just trying to live her life and take care of the temple of Athena. And because of the violence that is done to her, because of the violations that are done to her, she is not only kicked out from being someone who guards Athena's temple, she is turned into a gorgon. She is turned into a monster, who then they say, you know what? We're gonna make her a quest. We're gonna make her a quest, right? Slayage and seduction. And it felt almost too easy to say, yes, that let's look at that comparison and let's look at what are other bodies who are treated in this way, who are here only to be the playground thing, right, of the rest of the world. And so, you know, Beast Girl comes from that. It's about those of us who own the monstrous in us, right?
So, right. So positive. So if is my reading, like my initial reading of it being like a Beast Girl being this awful weight, but at the same time you can find strength in it or empowerment in it, because it's I don't know.
I think I think like any name, it's not going to be just positive or negative, right? And
Right, exactly.
it's because it's like the thing that protects you in this moment, being able to say, you know what, I don't need you to like me. I'm a beast. I'm a
Mhm.
beast. I don't need that. But there are moments when you need that softness and you need to put down your claws, right? And so that beast girl is an ownership, and it's also a being done to me, right?
Mhm.
In a way of in not allowing the space. And if this is the only space I can take up, I will take it up proudly and joyously.
Mhm.
But no, I think it'd be easier to be human, right? Like
Right, exactly. That
without,
whole like,
it's easier not to be someone that people will send out to kill you so they can attain whatever the hero's journey. No, it would be best not to be the hero and not the stop the hero takes,
right,
right? But I think that um, part of seeing yourself as something ferocious, right, is that it is going to be all of these things at once.
right. Absolutely. And I think that's why, and I would love, I mean, I don't know if you're ever going to go back to La Negra, but I think of her as that, I'm obsessed with that as a, you know, as that myth, the Negra as a figure and how she encompasses all these amazing things. And then, um, you know, the resentment, like when she has to be hard, right? And she resents that. Why do I have to be this way? Like, I don't want to be this way, right? And I would like to be other ways. And yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. So I think, and so your characters maybe, but we'll let Sophie continue on with the next question on your characters in
I
those
know you
novels.
get me in trouble. I'm like, oh, are they all beast girls? I don't know. I haven't thought of this.
Thank you so much for those answers. They were so beautifully spoken. But so one of my questions is that something we've noticed consistently throughout your writing is the presence of really complicated and multidimensional female characters of color. So in terms of your writing process, how do you go about centering women of color and specifically Afro Latinx women, and also their relationships to other women? Because I think that's something that we really noticed was that um, their relationships with other women are also really important.
Yeah. I don't tend to go into any of my writing with an agenda, even something like the Beast Girl Project, which isn't in the chapbook that you have, Professor Caballero. It's actually this suite of poems that exist outside of that. I'm constantly just what is the human experience I'm trying to get on paper, right? And so I'm less looking for answers or to look at a connection or look at this relationship and see what I'm trying to say about, you know, girls and their aunts. I think I follow a character into the world that she occupies, and in seeing the people that she loves and in seeing the people that know her, there's just so much that comes up. And for me, it is important. I have been writing about my mother since I was 8. That relationship, which is one that offers me so much solace, which offers me so much love, but also has offered me lots of shame and lots of difficulty, feels like what I'm always going to write. It's going to haunt me, right? Because that is the that she was a figure that took up so much of my imagination, right? And I think in many ways I've turned my mother into a figure to write about, right? In the myth I make of her. And so when I'm writing, I'm thinking through like, yeah, these are the relationships that feel foundational. If I'm writing about young Afro Latinx women, who are the folks who shape that, or who they're shaping themselves in spite of, right? And who are they going back and teaching the thing? Because I do write very much intergenerational stories. So there's always a guardian present, a woman figure present who is trying to pass something down. And there is always a young woman present who is trying to pass something back, who's also trying to say, wait, what about, or what if, or this thing you gave me all these good things, but this one thing, can we edit it? Is there a way to rethink this? Is there a way to let this go if it doesn't serve us? And so for me, you know, that comes up, you know, as I'm writing, it's just, I know that, for example, with the poet Xiomara, I wanted her to have a strong friendship, with another young woman, because so many of the questions around womanhood that she had could be ones that would break her spirit, unless she could look at this other girl and say, with you, I'm okay, despite how different we might be. That with Clap When You Land, for example, which I read, that Camino and her aunt have moments of tension. And also I wanted that figure to be one that allowed her to be free in a lot of ways, allowed her to find herself, and didn't always get what was happening, but was very clear that she would protect her at all costs, right? So there are certain things that I realized I need this character to perhaps be this for the main character, right? But then I have to go back and build the building blocks to make that so that I don't just go in and she's going to be super understanding. That sometimes it's like, no, the journey of this will allow her to be understanding. So I don't know. You'll see in Clap When You Land, I think there's maybe 2 male figures. Like I'm very focused on the hyper specific worlds of Black and brown women that I'm trying to tell. And yeah.
Well, yes, we were saying that even though the father is present in Clap When You Land, and there's this battle of like trying to forgive him, you know, he's not present in this world. I don't want to spoil anything for anyone, but so I mean, it's more about reconciling that with themselves, I felt when reading it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or yeah, and we also discussed that the decentering of the male voice, right? So what is your always, right? These your male characters, probably the most prominent one is now in Clap When You Land, and he's not even there, right? The papi, right? And he's not, and it's interesting that he's not even there, but his influence is still there, and they're all kind of marginal and on the side, and that's really refreshing, I have to say. But
Well, they're all ghosts.
right.
Even in the Poet X, the father is there, but I mean, she has this whole thing. He's present, absent, and with the Fire on High, the father is alive, but he's on a whole
Absent.
other island. And so, yeah, the project of father as present, absent is a thing. I would say an intentional thing. It is an intentional trying to grapple with a particular form of Latino fatherhood.
Right. It's also a way of right, and then the fact that patriarchy is still present even if the male isn't present. Right?
It's a ghost. It haunts us.
It does, absolutely. And although I feel your characters are, you know, lo van a superar, right? They're trying to go above it and beyond it, but it's really interesting how they're present and absent in that way. Great. Do you have another question, Sophie?
I do. So this is, again, more about your writing process, but what is the role that you think your writing has in the evolution of young adult fiction? Like we were talking about before this meeting, your writing is very different from the kinds of young adult fiction that I read and that Dr. Caballero read too. So basically, in other words, like what stories haven't been told in young adult fiction, and how does your writing potentially make strides to remedy that lack of representation, whether it's identities or certain experiences that you feel like aren't represented in young adult fiction now?
Yeah. I really do think I'm in a lineage of writers. I'm honored that you all think I'm doing something pretty new and innovative and different, but I think I'm following in the steps of Sandra Cisneros and Julia Alvarez and Jackie Woodson, right? That I read folks and felt like here is something honest and true. And I think I can do something honest and true with the language I have at my disposal, with my particular kind of Dominican Spanish, my particular poetic voice, my particular aptitude for hip hop and how that culture informs characters like mine. And so I think what's coming through is kind of this confluence of all of those different things coming together. But the stories I'm telling, um, I mean, Clap When You Land is probably a very different kind of story. I'll give that one. I haven't seen that particular thing described before, that the whole plane crash and then multiple,
Well,
families.
exactly. Well, I think it's what's interesting though, is I've never seen it in young adult fiction, but it's very much part of the culture, right? Like it's not a new story. I've heard the story, even maybe, know lots of people that have experienced it, but to see it in young adult fiction, right? And treated the way you treat it.
And I think that maybe that's the answer. That when I'm thinking of writing, I say, what is a story that I know that I have not read? Or what is a story that I've read but does not match what I know? And so when I there are books that have teen parents or have pregnant teens in them. There's a lot of young adult novels. I hadn't read one that had a teen parent who was actively taking care of her child, who was present on the page, that wasn't tragic. And so then my project was, I know these kinds of stories exist of the will she, won't she have the baby? What about after? What about 3 years later? Right. And so then that becomes the project. Oh, let me write that thing. That the Poet X, a lot of coming of age stories, we have characters that are butting up against their mom. But for me, it was, what about if she's afraid of her own body? Her mother's afraid of her body, but she chooses to do this thing where everyone has to look and listen to her body. That she chooses to, of her own volition, take up space, right? That then how poetry comes in allowed me to find a new vehicle. And so the stories feel familiar, probably because they are. Like, we know this, but it's just the again, the languaging. And I think that we're going to start seeing, there's a lot of folks that I think are my contemporaries who've been writing and we're in conversation. And I just got to publishing a little bit earlier, but I think many of us are um, writing the hard things in ways that children will have access to.
Absolutely. And we're about to go. We have lots of questions for you, so we're about to go to those. But my last question on this would be like, and you're talking about writing the hard things. How do you do you ever worry that you're going to perpetuate stereotypes, right? Like how you, I don't feel like you do, but it's like talking about these things, how do you portray these these characters so accurately, I feel like, without falling into stereotypes? Or is that something you worry about?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've worried for a long time about getting it right. And the first poem that I read tonight was very much about, like, here's who I write for. When I say this is for us, right? And so my biggest concern would be to say this is for us, and then the us arrives, and it's like, why are we depicted like this? Why, this is how you see us? And so, yeah, there's a lot of anxiety that I have around not getting it right. And what I've realized is that there are people who, as right as I think I've gotten it, will come back and say, I didn't think the way you depicted mommy was generous enough, or it didn't allow her enough nuance. I don't think the way that you depicted, Tyrone's mother, or Tyrone, or like that, this, so people will take issue anyways. I think the project I give myself is make sure that things are fully rounded, right? That no one character is flatly evil, no one character. It's probably why I try my best to allow the parents grace, if not at the beginning, by the end. It's why I try to say, here is someone who is difficult and complicated and loved, and who loved back, right? That none of us are any one thing. And so that seems to be the clearest way I can get away from the stereotype, is to show that they're full, They're not just an archetype. But for sure, it is difficult to undo, or to even recognize all of the things I've internalized that come out in the writing. and that maybe I miss in editing, that, you know, one of my homies will catch her, my editor will catch her, this, that, and third, right? It was my editor who was kind of like, you know, I think that this depiction of the Dominican Republic needs more nuance. It might seem too much like one thing. And so then I wrote all these scenes of, you know, Camino and her best friend going to the ocean side and getting ice cream, and the character of Don Mateo, this next door neighbor who like is loving, and so then I realized, yes, let me keep populating this world with tenderness and with pockets of light and hope, because that is the world and that is what we carry in addition to all the other things. So yeah, I get my coattails pulled, and I listen and pay attention and do my best.
Absolutely. I think you're not only your best, I think you're doing an amazing job. So we have a few questions. Elizabeth, I don't know if you'd want to do your reading first, like we discussed doing that, or would you rather do it at the end? How would you rather do it?
I'd rather do questions so that we see if we
Great.
can do them, and then we'll do a poem if we have
Great.
time.
Great. So we have a couple of questions I think I can combine here from Alicia Edwards first, and Alicia Edwards and Madeline Janney, they're both about Clap When You Land. The first one, Alicia talks about polygamy shapes Caribbean family structure, and we see it in Clap When You Land. What was your motivation for making both wives equally legally valid? And then Madeline Janney would like to know that her book club recently read it and we loved it. What stood out most to us was the way Yahaira's mom loved Camino near the ending. What made you decide to end the book this way? So those can kind of be combined, I think.
So the first question, I did a lot of research on the folks who were on Flight 587. And that was where the premise for Clap When You Land came from. There was grievance money that was offered by the airline, and you know, there were folks who had multiple families of similar legal status who were then trying to figure out who was legitimate or who would legitimately inherit. And so I think that it is it offered a different kind of complication to this man who was trying to have it all. I think it allowed for the conversation to be a little bit more complicated around who was hidden or who was the quote unquote main family, which I think is an important conversation, but was not the one I was undertaking in this particular book. The characters clearly ask that of each other and arrive at their own answers, but I wanted the reader to have the possibility of making their own choices on who the father was based off of these things. So it felt important to put them on an equal playing field. And when I first had the initial draft, that wasn't the case. One of the parents wasn't truly married or didn't realize that what the situation was. But I thought that discovery allowed for a lot. This idea that there are two marriage certificates. And it says a lot about choice and the choices the father made. So I thought that would add an interesting complication.
I also very much enjoyed, not enjoyed, but loved how it complicated him, and not only the two choices, but the daughters coming to terms with their father having two families too, as well, right? You know, Papi was a man split in two, and coming into that, I thought that was really beautiful as well in their growth, in their process of growth. And the next question was about Zoila and how Zoila at the end embraces Camino.
Yeah. I also really think it's important that DR can be so Catholic that I could see someone being like, well, the right thing to do would be to marry her, and not consider the right thing to do would actually be right. And so there was a little bit of hypocrisy is an interesting thing to also contemplate in this moment. Zoila went on a journey. I was really happy to discover Zoila. I am someone who fundamentally thinks that the story gives me everything I need to solve the story. And so when I wrote the draft and I figured out, these girls are going to need more help. They actually can't do what I think would be the kind of ending or the kind of closure that we need. They can't do that on their own. And I didn't want to solve it with any outside thing except for what was in the material. And so to have and allow this mother who was taking out her resentment towards her husband on a child, to maybe have to really face like, what is it that I have been doing? And why, and have I let my hurt and my anger towards this man um, do a disservice to a child who looks just like my daughter, who sounds like my daughter, who like, you know, like I think that that felt true, and it felt real. And part of the stories that we learn about, you know, when you learn about polygamy in the Caribbean, when you learn about folks with multiple wives, like I know folks who have taken in kids from other marriages and situations, and in son criado, or like are raised in a household where, you know, they multiple blending. And I thought that felt important too, that part of what I think my books push is, what do we consider functional families?
Mm-hmm.
And with The Fire on High, what does it mean for this child and her grandmother to be whole in the family that they are? What would it mean for these two girls and the tia and Zoila to be whole, right? That the choices we make of, you are now my family, and that is enough, right? I that does feel important to me. And I don't know, I try to make Zoila's journey an honest one, but yeah, I think that death changes us. And so maybe allowances she could not make before, she can contend with now.
Absolutely. I loved her transformation as well, that from the hard, again, that word that you use in your poem, like the hard soila, right? We know why she's been hard, and then she softens, right? She's given the opportunity to. She doesn't want to be hard, right? But life has made her that way. The situation with her husband made her that way. So Katura Nichols has a question. In Clap When You Land, can Papi be read as a bridge connecting Dominicans in the diaspora with Dominicans on the island? He is a catalyst that connects the girls, but by decentering the male figure, are the girls establishing a new Afro-Dominican identity, or even an Afro-diasporic identity, when taking into account other characters like Carline, and Dre?
Can I hear it one more time?
There's a lot there. There's a lot there. In Clap When You Land, can Papi be read as a bridge connecting Dominicans in the diaspora with Dominicans on the island? He is a catalyst that connects the girls. But by decentering the male figure, are the girls establishing a new Afro-Dominican identity, or even an Afro-diasporic identity?
Yeah, I think I love this idea of Papi having a foot in two worlds, and the manifestations of him that came out in each place. And by removing him, I think there is a little bit of like, what is the back and forth? What is the here and there? And the characters have a lot of ways in which they imagine their Dominicanness is tied to the other place, right? Camino Dreams has the New York City skyline etched, right? Like has this idea of, this is what migration looks like, or this is where the end goal could be. Which I think even Dominicans who don't ever want to leave the island, who don't want to live anywhere else, maybe perhaps even imagine visiting at some point, because it, you know, the States is a hub, and there's this whole culture of Dominicanness that is different than the island, but also the same, that I think people want to see, well, ¿qué es eso para allá? What's that over there that people leave for and don't come back? And so that Papi kind of navigates this, you have to go back. But you have to go back. And that each sister is also thinking of their Afro-Dominican, you know, identity in relationship to that other place. So maybe in some ways, you know, I hadn't thought about it, but Papi does play those two roles. And, you know, I was really trying to make a lot of, no, I wasn't trying to. It came out that it was important to make commentary on colorism and on race and on the different ethnicities within Blackness that exist. And so Carleni, who is Haitian, or of Haitian, Dominican Haitian, what is her existence and her reality that's different than Camino? that despite what Camino may be going through, look at this whole other perspective on Blackness that is also ignored in her own neighborhood or is disenfranchised, you know. And then we have Dre, who maybe is a little bit more affluent than Yahira, whose mother is a professor, whose father is in the military, but is also a particular kind of Blackness, has access perhaps to the language of queerness, to the language of ownership, because of the upward mobility that her parents have offered. But to me, it feels important to say there's a lot of ways to be a Black girl, to be Afrodescendiente, and look at how we have 4 characters in this book who have very different experiences. That I don't want an easy template on what I'm trying to say about race, because I don't think it's an easy thing to say, that Blackness is expansive, and also it's important to be clear on what solidarity within that can look like by honoring the differences and distinctions in each of these manifestations of Afro identity.
Great. Yes, thank you. So our next question is from Cynthia Gadsa. She's a middle school teacher here in New Orleans.
Hey.
And there are 2 things about your characters that stand out to me, she says. Number 1, the way that young women resist being sexualized and define their own sexuality. And 2, the stories of joy, which can be hard, and you mentioned that, which can be hard to find in YA BIPOC literature. So she's curious as how your narratives are informed by contemporary youth. What feedback have you gotten from young readers, and how that influences the way you write?
Yeah, prior to the pandemic, I was doing a lot of touring, mostly at middle schools, high school, colleges. And so it's been great to read these things out loud and then get feedback. And as you might know, middle schoolers will tell you exactly what they think. And so I have had middle schoolers be like, this section should have been funnier, or, you know, Malachi should have done this, that, and the third. And so people have very strong opinions, and it does help me fine tune my ear. But I find that most of the time when young people are moved by the work, it's just because they think it's true. Like it's the language and the slang and the references which felt contemporary, right? I think youth culture moves so fast that some of the references I made 3 years ago maybe aren't as relevant now. But I think the trueness of saying something that they feel like they cannot say in school, that they feel like they cannot say at home, that maybe they can't say with each other, seeing that on the page is what stands out. Someone saying, this is how I feel when I walk down the street and a group of men all look at me and one of them whistles. This is what I feel, right? And I think to see that and say, and I still love my neighborhood, and I still love my community, and I don't feel safe all the time, right? Like that is what I think, that allowing for those feelings that maybe young people have had and haven't had any say. Like, where would you have that conversation? Maybe with your girls, right? Maybe. Or like, hey, when I'm walking down the hallway and this group of boys all smack my butt, and that's not enough for me to like go to the teacher or go to the assistant principal, but it does something to me. That then seeing that in a book, having that discussed in class, knowing, you know, I am not alone in this experience. I think that is what folks are moved by, that the observations feel true and feel clear. And I was a middle school teacher. I taught 8th grade English. And so some of the things that I'm writing are also coming from the realization that what I felt and lived through however many years ago, my students, young women in my classroom, had children, had difficulties with their mothers, had situations with, you know, sexual violence that they didn't think they could talk about, that they had never seen, that they felt shame over, and something about putting light on things, right? Like that there's, you know, the wound needs a witness, and I think books allow for that witnessing, and that is what young people seem to be responding to, that it feels honest. I don't even know if I answered your question, but
No, I think you did. I think it did. It's just like their reactions, right? And if their feedback influences you, which you answered that. And, you know, and I think it is the honesty, right? And we discussed this before we started. You know, I am almost 50 years old, and you're speaking truths that I lived as well, right? But I was never able to read, never saw it, my experiences reflected anywhere. So it speaks to a lot of people of all ages. So that's amazing. That's absolutely incredible. So Marina Hernandez has a question on the Fire on High. It's a perspective, she's talking about the teen mother perspective, which you discussed and mentioned earlier, that it's not often portrayed in this kind of way. And as someone who bonded immensely with her grandmother through cooking, I found her relationship with her grandmother so beautiful. What or who inspired you to explore this experience?
Yeah, well, I mean, I like to think of With the Fire and High is a very different book than the other two books, not just because it's in prose, but also because it's the novel that I wrote during National Novel Writing Month in 2013. And I'm not an outliner, I don't draft. So a week before NaNoWriMo, I was in grad school at the time, supposed to be writing poems. I decided, I think I'm gonna try to write a novel. Like I had written part of the Poedex and I had written a fantasy novel prior to that, but neither one of these ever saw the light of day. They were just my practicing how to write a book, right? And I'm watching Chopped, and I love Chopped. I love the Food Network. If I'm on tour, that is what comes on right after show. It's like my woosah. It's just like, look at people making food out of 5 ingredients. Amazing, right? And so I'm watching Chopped, and it's one of the competitions where they have the teens competing. And I just thought, I know exactly who I would want to win. I know exactly who, like the kid I can imagine. And I swear to y'all, this kid just started talking in my ear, and it was Imani, who I didn't even remember. And so I think the book was published, and I had to go into my files because I'm like, I had a student named Imani. That's where that name comes from, right? That it was all of these things that came forth, but it was also, the story by Laura Esquivel, right? It is a little bit of Water for Chocolate, but in the hood, right? And the way that I said, like, I take stories that we know and sound familiar, and I'm trying to bring in a new thing or infuse them with something else. That for me, it was, if this kid was growing up in a single parent family household in a really Latinx and Black community in Philadelphia, and she had this amazing gift to bridge the nostalgia she feels about what she doesn't have from her lineage, from her parents, through food, what would that look like, and who would be there? And so her relationship with her grandmother, this figure who is the only person who often can taste what she's making, right? Who is her main almost communicator of this nostalgia, because Imani can't taste her own magic. It felt fascinating to me, and it felt like I was taking this magical realism, which is been developed in Latin America and in other parts of the world, but saying, what if we did something different? What if we remixed it? And so I wanted to attempt that. And Buela offered that. Buela also offered me a new way to talk about a woman parental figure. We've had a tia, we've had a mom, we had Buela, but like, here's this woman who like still has desires and has dreams, and can she realize like I'm not just the caregiver? And so I wanted this figure who supports and loves and also challenges, and their relationship over food, but also their relationship elsewhere, gave me a platform to allow these renditions of women to act on the page.
Right, and combining kind of like these traditional tropes that we associate with women, which would be cooking, but making them completely different. Yeah. Putting them alongside each other. And another question on the Fire on High from Katie Patterson. She teaches 6th grade English, and 2 of my book clubs have read or are reading With a Fire on High. And she says, wow, the students talked about who has the power in the book and how that changed throughout the text. We were very annoyed at Tyrone sometimes, ! How do you think the power shifts between the characters in With the Fire on High?
I love this question. Also, dope for you talking with your 6th graders about power, because everything I'm ever talking about is just like, where's the position of power? They're like, every context we need to identify where's the locus of control, what else is happening, right? And so amazing that your students are already using that lens with which to read work. I haven't heard it applied to my work before, so I'm geeking out, but also like, this is a hard question. I think Imani starts off thinking that she is really powerful in herself because she doesn't care what people think, because she doesn't need help. That her whole thing is like, I don't, I have been wounded enough. And so I just won't even let anyone tell me who I am or tell me anything about myself. I won't even try the things I think I would want to do, because I'm just gonna move through the world about me and my kid, and there's no time for dreams, right? But there's no time for any of that. And so I don't know that she realizes just how much damage has been done to her, and so there is a piece of her own power that she's missing, because she doesn't know if she's fully equipped to make the decisions she needs to make, right? And she's a character who is constantly toggling on whether or not she's doing the right thing, making the right choice. What is the right thing going to be? And so I think that her realizations at the end, when she is in this moment of, it might not be anybody but me. Abuela might have her own thing. Bobby might not come back. Angelica's leaving. Tyrone is asking for things that I'm not sure I can give him. I think that the trials and tribulations of that year allow her to reclaim that, to take that back. But the power for sure shifts and moves in a lot of ways. And it's her learning not to ask for help, for her realizing like part of power is realizing that you're loved and that you don't have to do this alone. And that by asking for help, you're able to do the things that move you, saying, okay, abuela, you're gonna go marry this guy, but maybe you could take care of baby girl once a week. Like that she could establish. I think she couldn't even think of establishing a new norm, right? There was so much fear. And so for me, undoing some of that fear, having her realize what it means to have faith in yourself, to really stand in her own name, was where she comes into her own understanding of her power. That's a great question. I'm going to have to think on it further. I don't, this is an answer on the fly, but I do think there's a lot there about all of the characters by the end arriving at something, probably because I'm writing about teen girls. And so power is a huge thing. How your body is owned, how your identity comes forward, how you are able to speak and stand for yourself. I think watching the journey is important, because so when I was a young woman and having worked with young women and spending time and space with young women, there is a lot of owning of yourself, right? Owning of yourself and really believing like, I'm not sure what's coming and I have no template and there is no blueprint, but I have everything inside of me to figure this out. I think it's an important message for us to hear. And so it's maybe why the characters always start lacking or feeling like they're lacking. And although nothing material often changes, they realize how full they are by the end.
That's great. Thank you, Elizabeth. And we have about 5 minutes left. I don't know how much time you need for your last reading, because there's several other questions about the writing process, about your ideal audience, about Spanish, if something's coming out in Spanish. So I'll leave that.
1 or 2 more questions. My poem is just a 1-minute poem, so it'll be
okay. Great. Fantastic.
Poem. We can.
So one of the questions that this is, I'm going to ask you.
This is Caballero said you're doing the poem. I'm not even going to get through this offer.
So America Hernandez wants to know if you're planning on releasing a Spanish version of Clap When You Land. I listened to your novel on Audible and truly enjoyed it. However, every time I listen to Camino, I could not help but think that since she was living in the DR, she had to think in Spanish. It would be amazing to see a Spanish-English version of your novel. And that's one of my questions for you too, is your relationship with Spanish, and also America's question about releasing a book. Have you ever thought about doing it in 2 languages, perhaps? Or was that even a consideration for Clap When You Land?
Yeah, no, I think I wield English better. And so I wouldn't write a version in Spanish. The attempt that I tried to make in Clap When You Land was to have it feel like Camino was translated. And so there are moments where the grammar breaks or the syntax matches what the word would be in Spanish. And so it's not, it should feel a little bit different on the ear, a little hard on the ear, because it's not trying to show she is thinking in Spanish, she is speaking in Spanish. I am writing the story in English. right? There is a Spanish version that will be coming out. We're still in talks over who will be that translator. Most of the publishers that have acquired the Spanish rights are based in Spain or in Argentina. And so there have been conversations about, what, making sure that the Spanish feels accurate and true to the stories. And so that's an ongoing conversation that I am having. And yeah, I don't write in Spanish. So I'm not sure. I don't know what a bilingual version will look like. I mean, I think there is something that folks are trying to do in saying, like, can we write our homelands, even if we are based here in the language that we have, is maybe not enough, but it is the language I have. And so what can I create out of that? And so for me, that was one of the hardest questions with writing a dual perspective novel. And also one of the questions that I'm having in adapting Clap When You Land into a TV show, that in that version, it very much has to be the characters speaking and thinking in Spanish. And so now I'm having to contemplate what the language and if the poems come in, or like what that will be. So great question that I'm also trying to answer.
Right, absolutely. And when I loved Amani, her relationship with Spanish, right? She was like, I'll speak it with my grandmother, but I don't want to speak it outside of that space. And that's how a lot of us growing up here, right? You feel good in with your family, right? In your home space, but outside of it, it's anxiety producing, right? Speaking in Spanish. And Elizabeth Manley, who's a professor at Xavier University, who she said, thank you so much for being with us and for your powerful writing. Given the context of your work, I imagine that you write with non-US resident Dominicans also in mind. Do you have different hopes for what they take from your work, and to clarify, Dominicans living in the Dominican Republic or in other places?
Yeah, I didn't think for a long time that I would have an audience in the Dominican Republic or in Latin America. In all honesty, it felt like the work that I had seen being produced felt different. And I also thought I would ostracize a lot of people. I thought my takes on Catholicism, my takes on race, my takes on gender, what I know of the Dominican Republic and how conservative its policies and its governance can be, made me think, I don't know if, I don't know. I was, really scared. And so it's been bolstering to see that there is a readership, that there is a community of Dominicans that feel Dominicans in the Dominican Republic that feel like, although it is diasporic writing, it is reflective, or it is in conversation with. I've been invited to be a part of, several different writing organizations in the Dominican Republic that put people up for prizes. And so for the first time have been put forward as a Dominican writer from, and so it is really rewarding. And it's opened up who I think my audience is. But I'd be lying if I said that I was, I think I've always been thinking, like, if a Dominican in DR picks this book up, I don't want them to feel hurt. I don't want them to feel like I am doing harm, right? But not that I even thought it would be translated. Like, I didn't even think the work would be translated when I first started writing. So I couldn't contemplate that folks would be reading it. Now things are different. And I would say with Clap When You Land, that's when I realized if I'm writing a character that lives in the Dominican Republic, and I have to be really, really thoughtful, more than I've ever been. And I think I'm pretty thoughtful, but more than that, that someone reading this feels like this character is thoughtfully put together, right? And tenderly put together. And I know you use the word tender a lot, but it feels really important to me because it's saying, like, you read this and you're loved. And so now the project has grown, right? And the things I'm currently writing and will be writing, I am imagining, my imagination's gotten bigger. So now I am thinking of folks on the islands and what that depiction needs to be or could be, or etc. But I also don't want to fall into the stereotypes that I did before, that it's just uber conservative and it's super Catholic, and that, you know, my tias, which kind of had questions about the Poet-X, and my mom who had questions about the Poet-X, but that's not the totality of folks who will read this, that there's a whole generation of folks who are like-minded, even if we are using, you know, different vocabulary. So I'm expanding who I think I'm writing for.
That's great. Thank you. It makes it, I'm sure it makes the process more difficult.
You know, but rich. But rich, because it is allowing to tell some of the stories my mother told me when I was little. If we want to go back to the very beginning, the first question, that, you know, what I'm writing right now is about my mom and her sisters and me and my cousins, and this, you know, 6-person point of view novel for many different generations, women who are 70, women who are 30, and what it means to be diasporic, what it means to go back, right, a fuller story of this experience. And so I don't know that I would have done that if I hadn't had all these other things written and gotten the reception or the feedback that I've gotten, and now started thinking, I think I can write this thing too, in a way that that people will respond to. So
great. All right, Elizabeth, thank you very much. Would you like to thank you? And we have a lot of other questions, but I know we're out of time. And will you take us out, please, with one of your poems?
Yes. So I hadn't planned on reading this particular one, but because there were so many educators, and I do think it's a good reminder. First and foremost, thank you all so much for being here. It's been beautiful to spend time with you all. It's been, you know, an hour and a half, and I you know, thank you for being here. I know it's dinner time.
Thank you. Thank you.
And in the middle of a storm. So I hope that, you know, weather calms down a bit. But this poem, I worked at an adjudicated youth center here in Washington, D.C. The majority of the young women I worked with were Black and brown. There was one day when a student was in my poetry workshop, and I would go every Monday. And it was one of those gigs where every Monday I went in, and you know, the young folks would be like, it's the poetry lady again, and like couldn't stand seeing me. And then at the end of the class, they're like, when are you coming back? And I'm like, literally every Monday. And if you could be excited, that'd be great, right? But it is an emotionally charged space, right? Because what folks have dealt with, what they've encountered, the kinds of abandonment people have faced, the poems about sexual assault that folks would write. Like, I would walk into that space and I knew where I needed to be. And on the days that I was not there, it was really hard, because it was a lot of emotionally charged things. And then all the girls go behind their doors and live in isolation for the next however many hours, right? So it was a tough space. So I come in one day, I'm not in a great mood. I have these poems, I hand them out. This one kiddo is trying me. She's throwing the poem on the floor. She's talking this and the third. The guards are starting to get irritated, right? And at some point, regardless of how much behavior management you might have, there are the rules of the space and the ways in which power is enacted in that space. And so even though I might want to be like, oh, I'll go stand next to her, I'll try positive reinforcement. Like, if the guard that day doesn't want, is it about that life? Like, it doesn't matter how holistic my healing wants to be. And so this day I'm annoyed, the kids are annoyed, the guard is annoyed, and they put this girl behind her door. And so then I'm like, dang, you know, she would get more if she were here. Even if she was disruptive, if we had got her writing, I think, you know, it would have been all right. And she started singing. She had this amazing voice. And she's singing, and now I'm like, oh, now she's gonna ruin the rest of the workshop. She's not even in it, right? And the girls are annoyed, like, tell her to shut up, tell her to shut up. And there's this one girl who just goes, she needs to sing. She needs to sing. Like, why can't she sing? And it was just that realization of how we fall into patterns of control and needing this space to look and sound like this thing, even as I propose in that moment that what we're trying to do is heal ourselves through poetry or through language. And so this is the offering I gave to myself, and the reminder I give to myself, and the reminder I want to give to all the educators in this space, but any of us who, deal with young people, or, anyone who has gotten caught up in the judicial system, knowing all of the hurt and pain that isn't being addressed. When the girl at the detention center asks you again, why we gotta write these damn poems anyway? Fold back the army knife of your tongue. This is not a place to create more bruises. Teaching creative writing is like convincing skin to graft itself after being wounded. You cannot teach and harm. They must be mutually exclusive. Remember, these are Black and brown girls in America. There is hurt here, inherited or otherwise, and trauma is a tapeworm growing in the gut until it gets so big you have to reach into your throat and pull it out from between your smile. Remember, teaching is not community service. Remember, teaching is not an automatic path to calling yourself an activist. Remember, we are not here to save lives. We are all just working on our own mosaic of aches. So when the girl at the detention center asks you again, why we gotta write these damn poems anyway? Tell her we write to remind ourselves we are still here and that we can still heal. Thank you all, it's been a pleasure.
Elizabeth, thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Sophie, and have a great night, Elizabeth. Thank you to everyone. Thanks for being here.
Take care.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate you, Sophie. Thank you so much, Professor Caballero.
No, thank you, Elizabeth. That was amazing.
Came through and hung out with us.
Yeah, all the people saying thank you. If you can see them coming through the chat.
Yes, thank you all so much. Thank you. Take care.